Ask you to please take your seat. We're going to get going here with the next panel. So we will be having a reception at 7 o'clock, so you have to hold off a little bit. Can I ask everybody to please take their seat? Okay. All right. I'm going to be introducing Dr. Robert Field, who will be the MC for this session. So Wyoming Goes Global, we've had a couple of panels already. We had one on international careers. We just finished another panel discussion on American foreign policy in the Trump era. And that's part of Wyoming Goes Global. The other aspect of Wyoming Goes Global, and the real heart of it, is celebrating the faculty and students and their international research. So we have two more events, I guess you would say, tonight. The first is our panel focusing on Wyoming Goes Global student and faculty presentations at 7 o'clock. So immediately after this panel, we move right into a reception and poster sessions. But this is celebrating the CGS fellows who we were able to support and the international research that they do. What you're going to see, I'll tell you what the theme is. It's the variety of funding that and kinds of projects across campus. And the Center for Global Studies is committed to funding international research and internships for students across all colleges and schools here at the university, and I'd say we have done that, and then also across all colleges and schools for faculty as well. I'm very pleased to introduce Dr. Rob Field, who is the Associate Director for the Center for Global Studies. Rob.
So it's not like me usually to be a man of few words, but I think I have to be tonight because we're trying to really keep to a time clock. Our presenters are trying to stick to about 10 minutes. So we're going to see 5 presentations that really show quite a wide arc of what we're trying to achieve at the Centre for Global Studies. Our funding is meant to really do something really simple, make the world a better place. So we're going to go on quite a journey. We're going to travel from fisheries through waste management, early childhood development, through internationalisation of higher education, right through to, let's say, peace and reconciliation in Northern Ireland. So that's quite a wide range, and we can do that because our job is to serve all the colleges in all departments. So therefore, our first thank you has to be to all the colleges and departments and our administration, because without these homes, we couldn't actually do this work. So thanks to all the faculty and support staff that make these projects happen. We provide this little bit of extra money in a world of diminishing resources that can sometimes be difficult to find, but this enables us to get overseas to do this very important research. So what we're seeing today are a few presentations, and we have some posters around as well, about half the projects that we funded. So as we move forward, what do we want to do? We want to fund more projects, and we hopefully want to give more dollars so that we can make a bigger difference. So that's our very, very simple aim moving forward. So with that said, our first presenter today, we're all going to try and introduce each other. Before I go any further, we're going to give applause to each presenter, but we're going to hold questions to the end and do the questions all together. So if you have a question, just sort of hold on to it. And if you're worried about forgetting it, write it down, right? So without further ado, Jessica Rick is our first presenter. She's currently here studying for her PhD in the program in ecology. She's actually already travelled quite a bit in her studies. We're going to be looking at fisheries today, but your undergraduate was University of Arizona in biology, where she received an honours award for that degree. She continued her education with a master's, University of Minnesota. And her research, again, shows how we have to be, I don't know, diverse and accepting of new challenges in the workplace. She's now working with fish, but she's also worked with owls and wolves. So without further ado, thank you very much for being here, and Jessica, take it away.
So thank you very much for that introduction, and thank you all for being here today. As he mentioned, I'm Jessica Rick. I'm a PhD student in the program in ecology in the Department of Botany. And I'm going to be talking to you today about a piece of my PhD research focused on the fishery in Lake Tanganyika And I'll be talking a little bit about how this is a very critical natural resource for Eastern Africa. So to start off with, Lake Tanganyika is one of the African Great Lakes located in Eastern Africa. It's the second oldest lake in the world, the second deepest lake in the world, and the second largest lake in the world by volume. It holds roughly 20% of the world's fresh water. So Lake Tanganyika shares its border with 4 different African countries: Burundi, Tanzania, Zambia, and Congo. And these shared borders have really important implications for the management and conservation efforts and policies that have to do with the lake. So when I say that Tanganyika is the second largest lake in the world, I thought I might orient you a little bit with something you might be a little bit more familiar with. So Lake Tanganyika is roughly 420 miles long, and if we were to take that lake and overlay it on the state of Wyoming, it would actually almost extend all the way from corner to corner. So this is a really big lake that has plays a really important role in the region. And with it being such an old lake and such a large lake, Lake Tanganyika is really known for its incredible biodiversity. There are almost 300 species of fish that are found within this lake and nowhere else in the world. And the same goes for many other types of aquatic organisms and the wildlife that lives on its shores. And in addition to these wild creatures, there are also almost 10 million people who live within the greater basin around where Lake Tanganyika is. And these people depend on the lake both as a source of livelihood and a source of food. So much of my research focuses on the fishery in Lake Tanganyika. And this fishery is a really important protein source for those communities that surround the lake and provides approximately 60% of the protein for those 10 million people who live in the greater basin area. The fishery is dominated by pelagic fish, so these are the fish that live out in the open waters of the lake. And there are predominantly 6 different species of fish that are eaten out of Lake Tanganyika. And 4 of these are really closely related species within the genus Lates. So the smallest of these is Lates stapersii, and this fish grows to be about 2 feet in size, and it tends to be very abundant. The next 2 are the medium-sized Lates mariae and Lates microlepis, and then the 4th one is Lates angustifrons, and this is the largest and has actually been recorded at sizes of up to 6.5 feet. So these are really big fish. And these 4 fish are relatives of the Nile perch. So who here has heard of Nile perch before? How about Lake Victoria? So those of you who have heard of Nile perch or Lake Victoria are maybe familiar with this guy, Lates niloticus. So Lake Victoria is just to the northeast of Lake Tanganyika, and Lates niloticus was introduced there in the 1950s when the fishery in Lake Victoria was declining. So it was introduced as a really large fish that could then supplement the local fishery. However, it's also really well known because it caused a huge ecological disaster within the lake and caused the extinction. There are estimates that up to 80% of the native fish species in Lake Victoria went extinct following the introduction of this fish. So these 4 Nile perch that we have in Lake Tanganyika are native to the lake. They evolved there, they belong there. However, they're still big fish that play a really big role in the ecosystem within the lake. However, in recent years, there's some evidence that population sizes of all 4 of these fish have declined, and there's estimates that we've lost 50% of all of these populations just over the past 30 years. So the larger 3 Lates have declined much more significantly than the smaller ones, but the 3 biggest ones are listed by the IUCN as either threatened or endangered. And this pattern is similar to what we see all over the world in recent years, where we see catch rates and fish populations declining, and then we also see fish sizes declining as well. And so with these patterns, the big question is why? What is happening to cause such a dramatic decline in this lake and in lakes around the world. So there's the idea that it could be from overfishing. We're just catching too many of these fish. It could potentially just be natural fluctuations within the population, and we're just seeing this small snapshot, and so it looks like they're declining dramatically. And then the third idea is that it could be tied to climate in some way. And so within Lake Tanganyika, we have some evidence that lake temperatures are warming and have been warming over the past 1,500 years, and especially over the last 600 years, we've seen a dramatic increase, which parallels the increase that we've seen in global temperatures as well. And if we dig into this a little bit more, we see that with this change in temperature, we have a parallel change in the resources available to organisms living within the lake, and a parallel decline in fish abundances as we've measured using fish fossils and fish scales that are found in the sediments in the bottom of the lake. So this suggests that there may be a tie there, that climate could be playing a role as well. However, this is looking at the past 600 years, and Lake Tanganyika is 9 to 12 million years old. So this is really just a snapshot in time still. And so with my research, my goal is to understand what has happened historically in Lake Tanganyika so that we can understand what's going on currently and potentially predict what might happen in the future. So my goal, I want to determine what's normal. Do we see these kinds of fluctuations all the time historically, or is this really much more dramatic than anything we've ever seen? And so to do this, I'm using the genetics I'm doing some genetic work with the fish and then combining it with what we know about the environmental history from sediment cores, which is what's pictured there on the right-hand side. So for this work, last summer I had the opportunity to do fieldwork in Kigoma, Tanzania, which is on the eastern shore of Lake Tanganyika. So I traveled to Kigoma and went to local fish markets and talked to the local fishermen, both to kind of get an idea of what the situation is, and then also to collect samples that I could bring back for my genetic analyses. In addition, I had the opportunity to snorkel around and actually see these fish in their native habitats, and especially the juvenile fish, which live inshore, where we can see them really easily. And then importantly for me, because my research has conservation implications, I also had the opportunity to give a presentation to the Tanzanian Fisheries Research Institute. And so these are the local managers actually trying to work to maintain these fish stocks. So to share with them what my research is and then also get feedback from them about what really is important to them. So with these samples that I've collected, I'm using the DNA of these fish to get at what happened historically in these populations. And so the DNA contains a record of the historical population sizes. This is true of any organism. But I'm really harnessing this power in these fish to take that DNA and decode what has happened in the past so that I can get an idea of what the population trend was as we go back historically through time. And then potentially identify areas in time that were really interesting for some reason. So potentially where there is a big decline or a big increase. And then once I identify those regions, then I can look at what was happening with the climate and say, okay, we see this big decline. What was happening within the lake to result in this decline? So that's where I am right now, is I'm working on teasing these things apart and working on trying to figure out what really is important in driving these population sizes. And this is the science that I'm working on. However, preventing future declines in these fish isn't just a scientific issue. There are many other things going on in the lake other than just these fish populations going up and down. So last summer, I also had the opportunity to go to the African Great Lakes Conference on the shores of Lake Victoria. And this was a conference aimed at bringing everyone together who has some sort of a stake in the future of these lakes. So it involved scientists and policy makers and some public health officials and really looking holistically at what's going on in this region. And then additionally, so I had an opportunity to hear talks from people who actually live in the area as well as the people doing research there. And then we had the opportunity to go out to a local fishing village where this community was able to show off what they've been doing to try and mitigate this themselves. So they've been raising fish in these fish ponds, and they got to show off these beautiful fish that they've been raising so that they aren't further decreasing the fish stocks. So this is just one thing that they're working on doing as their way of understanding what's going on and preventing the decline in the future to really make sure that they have that food source going into the future. So hopefully my science will be able to play a role in some of these ideas as well. So with that, I would like to thank all of my funding sources and also all of my lab mates who have helped to make this research happen. And with that, I thank all of you guys for listening as well. So then, as was mentioned, we'll be taking questions at the end. So I would like to introduce our next speaker of the evening, Danielle Peck. Danielle is from Lovell, Wyoming, and she got her bachelor's in international studies here at the University of Wyoming, and is currently pursuing her master's in international studies and environment and natural resources here as well.
Hello. So with a background having lived and studied in Germany, as well as having worked on a developmental recycling project in Wyoming, I decided to do my master's research on waste management in Germany. So historically, waste was a lot more visible than it is today. For instance, communities often would throw the trash in the gutter, and that caused a lot of problems with rats, as well as illnesses similar to the plague. And since then, waste has had to be managed in different ways. And one of those ways is with landfills. So a landfill creates a space to bury waste and cover it with soil. And a pro to this would be that the landfill makes the waste invisible. A con is that it's most likely polluted that environment. So Germany is a Western European country. It has about 9 touching bordering countries, or 2 if you cross the sea. It's the 7th largest country in Europe, and it is similar in size to the state of Montana. It also consists of 16 different Bundesländer, or states, and I did my research in 3 of them, 3 former German Democratic Republic, or Eastern German states: Berlin, Brandenburg, and Mecklenburg-Vorpommern. So just for some history, after World War II, Germany was split between the 4 different world powers, so the United States, the United Kingdom, France, and the Soviet Union. Western Europe agreed that the best way to create a peaceful Germany would be by using the Marshall Plan, which involved creating a stable global economy. The Eastern Sphere disagreed, and they thought that the way to create a peaceful country was to control it economically. So this is what happened. The Iron Curtain and the Berlin Wall was created, and this separated both the Western and the Eastern spheres, or blocks. And this created also the Federal Republic of Germany, the FRG, also known as West Germany, and the German Democratic Republic, the GDR, also known as East Germany. So the wall stood from 1961 to 1989, and during this time, the Federal Republic of Germany developed a very strong economy in comparison to the German Democratic Republic. So it also created some very progressive environmental policies that were implemented, and this gave them the reputation of being quite environmentally friendly. Due to the very stringent landfill policies that were put into place, as well as just really expensive waste transportation costs, they came up with an idea to pay the German Democratic Republic to dispose of their waste. Now, we must keep in mind that Western trash is a lot different than Eastern trash. For instance, Eastern Germany didn't have plastic. It was too expensive. a plastic bag was actually considered Western propaganda. So when this Western trash came into the East, they didn't have the proper environmental waste management infrastructure to safely dispose of this waste, and it was often disposed of in unfilled landfills. And this gave them the reputation of sacrificing the environment in order to keep up with the West economically. So, as you can imagine, there was a lot of environmental pollution. People that lived around these landfills, as well as worked within them, often got sick. And one of my interviewees told me that there was an 80% increased cancer risk for people that worked within the landfills compared to people that worked outside. They also were often built within rural communities for many reasons, and one being that there would be fewer voices to speak out against the environmental degradation that was taking place. So, as you can see, people didn't stay quiet. Unfortunately, a lot of these protests took place closer to reunification. So, this picture on your left shows one of the protests. The banner says, "We are against the trash importation of any kind." The top picture on your right says, "In East and West, it smells like the plague." And the picture on the bottom says, "Schöneberg," which is an Eastern an Eastern German community, as well as Lübeck, a Western German community, are united against the trash mafia in both the East and the West. This is interesting because it shows that people are understanding the responsibility lies in both the Federal Republic of Germany and the German Democratic Republic. So when I went to Germany, I really had three main questions. How did the waste management actions in both the West and the East influence the landscapes in the GDR? I also was curious what happened after reunification, and I wanted to know how could trash produced in the West that was transported to the East transform the receivers as themselves as a wasteful society? So in order to do this, I followed a theoretical framework called New Cultural Geography. And this basically says that our cultural and political discourses materialize in our landscapes. These landscapes also can influence these discourses. And in order to really interpret the environment, I did use a method called landscape interpretation. And this is a method that can show how cultural landscapes are created over time. And in order to do that, to interpret the environment, I had to use a mixed methods approach of semi-structured interviews of sanitation workers, environmental organizations, and citizens in German. And then I also did some policy analysis and archival research to really help me fill in those gaps that I wasn't able to get in my interviews. So here's an example of landscape interpretation. This is a landfill that I visited in Brandenburg. And the man that I interviewed actually grew up right next to this lake and worked within this landfill before and after reunification. So the top picture here is a picture he gave me, and as you can see, this was once a community lake. And while it was a community lake, it also became a place for the community to make their waste invisible. So for instance, my interviewee, we can call him Klaus, his favorite pastime was to take a BB gun, walk around the landfill, and shoot floating light bulbs as a kid. That's what he did. And then today, it's this giant landfill that was actually closed down in 2005 after some major policies were put into place. This is also one of my favorite landfills that I visited. It's also within Brandenburg, and I love it because it goes from a heap of trash and then was closed down in 2005 as well, and now it's a hill of wildflowers. And a side note, the reason there are so many wildflowers on this hill is because it's kind of been reclaimed by the environment, and wild pigs visit and congregate there once a year, and they help spread the seeds around. Okay, so this top picture here will show what happens when we don't manage waste. The second picture down shows an active landfill in Germany, and then the bottom picture shows the end product. This is a landfill that was closed. What I found when I went over to ask these questions was that a lot of the former GDR landfills are actually owned by private companies that don't want to be linked to the past. They don't want to talk about the waste trade, and they didn't really want to talk about the conditions of the landfills during the Cold War. So, through all of that, I found that there was also a lack of trust between citizens and these waste management companies where the environmental degradation took place. For instance, one of my favorite quotes says, "If you're not into drug trafficking but want to make just as much money, then you should go to the garbage trade because the structures are comparable and there is certainly a lot of it." So this research project shows that the waste trade is neither the responsibility of the FRG or the GDR, but that also the FRG environmentalism is dependent upon the deportation of this waste. So it didn't really solve a problem of waste, but rather it transferred the problem to another population that was less able to solve the problem. So I believe that we need to really focus on multi-scalar policy that stems from a local to a global level that can show the transparency of our waste crossing borders. Today, our waste may be invisible, but we all create waste. And waste trades do occur all over the globe. So we need to really make sure that we can try to prevent these inequalities that can make these waste trades possible. So, besides finishing writing and defending my thesis, in a couple of weeks I'll be traveling to the the American Association of Geography's annual conference in New Orleans, where I will be competing in a landscape specialty group presentation competition. So, and I would like to give a big thank you to my thesis committee, especially my thesis advisor, Dr. Nicholas Crane, and other UW faculty who have helped me through this process. And a big thank you to the Center for Global Studies, the Nielsen family, the John P. Ellbogen Foundation, Dick and Lynn Cheney, the Saunders Walters families, and also the Hobbs School of Environment and Natural Resources. And next we have Haley Gobert from Browning, Montana. She received her bachelor's degree in resource economics at the University of Connecticut and is currently working on her master's in agriculture and applied economics here at the University of Wyoming.
Hi everyone, I'll be talking a little bit about the economics of early literacy and music exposure in New Zealand households. Early exposure to literacy and music is really important for child development and has important links to success in later adulthood. So my research combines 3 different areas of literature, literacy, music, and economics, shown here by this Venn diagram. So early literacy develops a child's sound awareness, vocabulary, and recipient language skills. Children develop their literacy skills in a few different ways, from browsing common print materials in the home like newspapers or religious texts, through shared storybook reading with parents, and also more informal interactions like nursery rhymes or playing with letters and letter sounds. Children who engage in music training even for a limited time show increased neural enhancements. This is because music develops all aspects of a child's brain, including the parts associated with emotion, cognition, and memory. Music also develops spatial temporal reasoning, which is the brain's ability to conceptualize, think through steps to difficult problems. It's also important to note the type of exposure and the length of music exposure as well. This is because neuroplasticity is most prominent during childhood and begins to decline over time. And active engagement in music is what's important. Many people cite the Mozart effect as making them or their child smarter, but that's not true. What's important is actively engaging in music, and this is through singing or playing an instrument, and the enhancements are even stronger if your child is doing both. And so there's a bit of a cognitive overlap in between literacy and music. This is because they share the same auditory and cognitive mechanisms, and this process is used for internalizing and discriminating sound, and this process is used for phonological awareness, which is the broad ability to understand sound and language, and also phonemic awareness, which is the ability to understand individual sounds of words. So recent economic literature has focused on human capital development before age 5. This is because of the growing realization that the early childhood environment can have meaningful and lasting effects on adult outcomes. And so some economic literature has looked at literacy and music, but looking at them together in this context is non-existent. And so my research fills this nice gap where this little inverted triangle is. So what is human capital? Human capital was developed by economist Gary Becker, who believed that expenditures in education, training, and health were investments in human capital. He felt that education and training were the most important of these. And it's called human capital because people can't be separated from their knowledge or skills the way they can be separated from physical or financial assets. So this past summer, I traveled to Auckland, New Zealand for my thesis research. This is because I'm using the Growing Up in New Zealand longitudinal study for my research. The study is located at the Tamaki campus of the University of Auckland, which is where I spent most of my time. Auckland is up here in the North Island. I also traveled to the University of Otago, which is down here in Dunedin, to meet with several literacy experts. So the literacy curriculum in New Zealand has recently been critiqued. This is due to a persisting gap in between high-achieving and low-achieving students in literacy. And this gap has persisted since the early 1990s, despite New Zealand having a unified national curriculum and also having the Reading Recovery Early Intervention Program. And so here I have a graph of the progress in international reading literacy study. This assessment is an international comparative assessment that has been administered every 5 years since 2001. Here I have New Zealand in green, the US in this dashed light blue, England in the dotted navy, Sweden in yellow, and the Russian Federation in red. As you can see, New Zealand has consistently scored well below other developed countries and has recently seen a decline in literacy over the past 2 assessments. And so for comparison, Morocco has also been in the assessment, and they typically score around 300. So the music curriculum in New Zealand has also been critiqued. This is because the curriculum has stagnated for the past few decades. And this is because music is considered a superficial activity in New Zealand. This leads to a lack of funding for the programs and also teachers receiving inadequate training in music. And so the University of Otago, the Ministry of Education, and the New Zealand Council for Educational Research collaborated to create this national monitoring study of student achievement assessment. And this assessment is designed to look at different areas of the New Zealand curriculum over the years. And so in 2015, the music curriculum was selected, and they found that year 4 and year 8 students were achieving well below expected curriculum levels in music. And also that while there are some music opportunities in New Zealand schools, kids just aren't taking advantage of them. So the objective of my research is to understand the influence of household characteristics on early childhood human capital development in New Zealand households. While in New Zealand, I got to see the literacy and music exposure firsthand. I visited playgroups, which are informal parent-run programs that meet about twice a week for 2 hours. I also visited kindergartens, which are similar to preschools here in the United States. I also visited Maori preschools, which are complete immersion. They're similar to the other preschools. I got to visit 2 different types of kohangas. This one was run by the university, and it was unique in that it was well-funded and well-staffed, and they had a lot of resources. This other one I visited in a Maori community in Northland, which is in the north part of the North Island in New Zealand. And this was more typical of what kohangas are like across the country. It was a little run down. There weren't very many teachers to how many students were there, and also they didn't have as many resources as the University Kohanga had. So as I mentioned before, I'm using this data from growing up in New Zealand. This is a longitudinal study that began in April 2009 and March 2010 with about 7,000 children participating. Pregnant mothers were recruited from Auckland, Manukau, and Waikato, and this was to ensure that results from the study would be broadly applicable to the current birth population in New Zealand. Today, parents have been interviewed before birth at 9 months, 2 years, and 4.5 years. So the data set includes 6,000 variables and 16,000 observations. So I'm using an econometric theory adapted from Gary Becker's theory of household utility. This is an alternative theory to neoclassical economics, where the household is combining time and resources to provide these literacy and music experiences. And so I use this data to see what effects the different exposures have on developmental outcomes as a measure of enhanced human capital. So in my analysis, I use an ordered probit model. We can think of this really generally where child development is a function of parental investment in these types of exposure, as well as various socioeconomic factors. And so my model does show significance between child development and things like occupation, what ethnicity the child is, what kind of music and literacy exposure is the child receiving, how many books are in the household, how often are they being read to, are they visiting a music group, are they singing together, these types of things. Also, which parent is providing the exposure is important. I also use the New Zealand Deprivation score. This is a household receives a score between 1 and 10, and 10 being most deprived. I use this as a proxy of income. I also find significance there as well. So for my next steps, I'm wrapping up the last bits of my analysis, preparing to defend my thesis in a few weeks. I might also potentially return to New Zealand. This past fall, I received the Andrew and Connie Van Wyk Fellowship, and the donors' wishes are that the fellowship is used for thesis research. And so returning to New Zealand is one way of putting that fellowship to use. I would like to thank the Center for Global Studies, the Ag Econ Department, and the Office of Academic Affairs for their support. I would also like to thank my advisor, Dr. Mariah Emke, for her encouragement and support as well. Thank you. Next up, we have Cecile Glaze. She is from France. She completed her undergraduate degree here at UW. She's currently pursuing an MA in International Studies.
Hi, so I chose to do my research on the internationalization of Chinese higher education. What I mean by internationalization is I'm using John Hudsick's term of comprehensive internationalization that he defines as essentially infusing a commitment and action to infuse international and comparative perspectives at the higher education level. Internationalization of higher education can be further categorized into 3 groups. So there's sending students abroad, receiving foreign students, and cross-institutional partnerships. My research focused on international students in China. So for my fieldwork, I went to Harbin, which is located in the northeast of China, in the province of Heilongjiang, which you see here in red. Harbin is the yellow star. Harbin has a population of 10 million, which is actually relatively small for China. For reference, the largest US city is New York with a population of 8.5 million. It's also known as a point of intersection for Chinese and Russian culture. This is the Orthodox Church of St. Sophia in the center of Harbin, and also the emblem of Harbin. You may have also heard of it as for its annual hosting of the Snow and Ice Sculpture Festival, seen here. But most importantly, the reason why I went there is because that is where the Harbin Institute of Technology is located. It is part of China's C9 League, which can be comparable to the US Ivy League system. So before I go into my research, I'd like to contextualize internationalization that make it, or the Chinese characteristics that make the Chinese approach to internationalization unique. So as of right now, currently, the US is the top destination for international students, while China is the top sender of international students. Similar to Haley in the previous presentation, I'm also using human capital theory, and if we subscribe to human capital theory interpretations that if you invest in individuals, you'll see a return on investment in both individuals and society. This means that China would stand to benefit from turning this flow of students around and diversifying its international students. China has changed tremendously in the past decades, ever since it opened up. They've launched a series of successive reforms aimed at improving economic, political, and social targets. Most of these targets are achievable through internationalization of education. What makes the Chinese system specific, and thus the Chinese approach specific, is that whereas the US system of education has participative thinking education, where students engage with the professor and ask questions during lectures, the Chinese system emphasizes a non-participative approach, where you have usually uninterrupted lectures and rote memorization. So these three essentially can boil down to the Chinese approach, which is modernizing or internationalizing their educational system while retaining Chinese characteristics, which I find is well illustrated by this political cartoon of Xi Jinping, one side facing to China, one side facing to the world. So to guide my research, I had two questions. I was interested in mapping the mechanisms and actors driving internationalization in China. And also, I was interested in finding out how institutional and governmental internationalization agendas affect students and faculty at the Harbin Institute of Technology specifically. So you have national policies, you have regional policies, and institutional policies, and I wanted to see how they, what the experiences, the impact on the experiences of students and faculty were. So to that end, I conducted 8 weeks of fieldwork at the Harbin Institute of Technology, interviewed 38 students and faculty, both Chinese and domestic. The second phase of my research is what I'm doing this semester is doing discourse and content analysis. So I'll be looking at national, institutional, and regional level marketing communication or recruitment communications for these three levels. So I can't really speak to the content and discourse analysis, but what I'm finding so far is that it's a multi-scaled, internationalized agenda. If you recall the Venn diagram for a couple of slides ago, you have all these policies at different levels being enacted, and while some may align with each other and complement each other, these groups or levels may operate independently and may have adverse effects on international students or faculty, or may translate to different experiences. I'm also finding that due to the internationalization challenges unique to China, with factors such as heavy government interference and the difficulty of learning the Chinese language, this is translating to, while the policies are well-intentioned, this is translating to resulting in human and educational alienation. So out of the 22 international students I interviewed, I found that I could categorize their motivations for going to China into 3 categories. Those were financial aid and opportunity. China has a very robust scholarship program with national partnerships, enterprise partnerships, and also regional partnerships. And it's very likely that if you're an international student in China, you're fully funded. Another motivation that I found recurring was the desire to learn the Chinese language and Chinese culture. Of course, if you want to learn Chinese culture, your best bet is China. Harbin also holds the distinction of having a very standardized Mandarin accent, so it's really desirable to Chinese students for that reason. And then there's also the reputation of Harbin Institute of Technology. Who's heard of the Harbin Institute of Technology? Oh, okay, all right, I was expecting no one, but. So within China, it's really well known. If you graduate from there, you automatically can find a job. It's ranked number 10th. Within Asia, it's still known, but not to a great extent. It's ranked 37th, and if you see the little number underneath, it's ranked 304th in the world, which accounts for the reason why many of you may have not heard of it. However, if we divide it by programs, and it is called the Harbin Institute of Technology, if we look at engineering specifically, you can see that globally it ranks 6th. Another fun fact is that one of the most notable alumna from there is Fang Bingbing, and he was responsible for engineering the Great Chinese Firewall, which, regardless of what we think of that, is a great feat of computer science engineering. So one of the examples of the motivators for coming to China, I selected Daniel, a student who came from Kenya. Now I'll read you part of his quote. He said that the Chinese government offered our government, the Kenyan government, roughly 40 scholarships a year. That is a far cry more than any other government has offered our country. So what we see here is that essentially what I learned through this conversation is that he felt that China was the only door open to him at that time. It was the only opportunity. And while the U.S. remains a top destination for international students, the reality is that it's very difficult to get in due to visas or just training mismatches. If you see lower in the quote, he was saying that the secondary education system in Kenya had not prepared him for the GMAT or the GRE at the U.S. level. An example of the outcomes of internationalized education policies is alienation of international students and sometimes Chinese students and faculty. So you can have physical, human, or educational alienation. There's a perceived commodification of foreign students. There's a de-incentivization of linguistic integration, and that's actually a well-intentioned policy to widen the net to recruit more international students, and owing to the difficulty of the Chinese language, it's actually really hard. There's also a perceived treatment between Chinese students and international students among both Chinese and international student groups. There is a physical separation of students on campus. This is a campus map. I actually had to crop it because I couldn't fit it all on the slide. So for reference, maybe the international student dorm is here, and then you have the international student building there. International students, if they wish to live on campus, and this is the case for many Chinese universities, must reside in an international student dorm. And again, the reason for this is well-intentioned. In China, the norm for dorms is 4 to 6 students per room, and the Chinese believe that the foreigners would not be able to handle that, so they assign them to 2 to 4 students per room. However, HIT has seen its capabilities or resources mismatched for the influx of international students. So they've actually outsourced many of their dorms to 3 partnerships with hotels in Harbin. So it's actually they're further separated with a 20-minute walk. That's actually where I resided when I was there, in hotels, which again comprise only of international students. And then last but not least, and this is common in all internationalized education models globally, is self-alienation. So I'm still analyzing and drawing implications in conclusion, but so far the significance of this is that there are changes in the global education network. China is on the cusp of a huge human capital outflow change, and we have to consider what does this mean for the United States, considering this current political climate. if we think of student visas. For future research directions, I think it would be, what I would like to explore is how the value of the Chinese diploma for international students within China in obtaining Chinese jobs. If an HIT diploma translates to an automatic job for a Chinese national, is that the same case for an international study, an international student? Okay. So I'd like to acknowledge Ali, first and foremost. He's a student at the Harbin Institute of Technology, and he helped me recruit over half of my participants. And of course, I'd like to thank the CGS Centennial Fellowship, the Elbogen International Studies Research Excellence Fund, my department, my thesis committee, and faculty, and Yan Zhang, who is actually the the head of the Chinese department here on campus, and she also was actually a graduate of the Harbin Institute of Technology, and Chen Daqing, who was the international student coordinator back at the Harbin Institute of Technology. So next up, I'd like to introduce Dr. Nevin Aiken, who is an associate professor of political science and international studies. He received his PhD from the University of Columbia in 2010. Over the last decade, his research is largely centered on themes of justice, peace, and reconciliation, particularly in Southern Africa and Northern Ireland. The talk you'll hear today will concern his work in Northern Ireland.
Hello, everyone. So as Cecile was saying, my name is Nevin Aiken. I'm a professor here in the New School of Politics, International Studies, and Public Affairs. And I'm going to be talking a little bit about my work in Northern Ireland. And as many of you know, I know some of you have been in my classes previously, a lot of the work that I do is on these areas of international peace and conflict studies, human rights, and transitional justice, which essentially looks at how societies try to reckon with past histories of human rights abuses and how that links up and lines up with potential for peace building, reconciliation, and building things like sustainable democracy in some of these post-conflict societies. And what I've been really interested in recently is looking at some of these questions around the more distributive or socioeconomic questions that are bound up with some of these. And I should say, in this, I am certainly not alone. There's lots of people in the past history of peace and conflict and also transitional justice that have looked at this. And there's a lot of studies out there, a lot of case studies where we've looked at how socioeconomic factors are a huge causal factor or contributing factor in intergroup violence in divided societies. So again, in places like South Africa that were mentioned during the institutionalized racism of apartheid, a direct contributor to the anti-apartheid violence that we saw there. Also in peace studies, there's a big recognition now that if you're going to build sustainable peace in a society, this kind of positive and lasting sustainable peace, that these kinds of issues have to be addressed. These inequalities have to be addressed, not just physical violence, but also what they call structural violence, and removing that, and that as a root cause of violence has to be done. And even my own field of transitional justice, where I do a lot of work, where we look at how, specifically how you provide accountability for past human rights abuses, there's increasingly a recognition that we have to pay attention not just to providing accountability, things like truth and justice, for physical rights violations where we often focus, but also we really have to address and pay some attention to all of these socioeconomic factors that are often underlying and maybe even causing this violence in the first place if we're going to move towards things like lasting peace and reconciliation. And this is really interesting stuff to look at in the context of Northern Ireland. Of course, I would say that, but Northern Ireland, for those of you that don't know the context or the background, this was an area, depending on who you talk to, it's a conflict that's been going back hundreds of years. The more modern incarnation, colloquially known as the Troubles, lasting for a few decades in the latter half of the 20th century, where we saw local communities of largely Catholic nationalists or Republicans pitted against largely Protestant Unionists or Loyalists, and involved in a three-cornered fight also with the British state and security forces as well. Largely a conflict over what should the future national status of Northern Ireland be. Should it remain within the United Kingdom? Should it become part of the new Irish Republic that was formed after partition in 1921? So that is obviously the genesis of the conflict, but of course a lot of people that know Northern Ireland know there was huge economic factors underlying it, particularly underlying the nationalist side. Many of you might be familiar with the really iconic civil rights movement that went on in Northern Ireland during the 60s, kind of mirroring what happened in this country, and largely reacting to these broad patterns of domination and discrimination that was going on by the unionist majority that was living in Northern Ireland over the Catholic minority. And this was across every socioeconomic sector. So access to political rights, widespread gerrymandering was going on, things like access to housing, employment, income, basically any metric you would look at, there was severe discrimination going on. And so this formed the basis for initially the civil rights movement, turned eventually into rioting. That rioting eventually turned into open and outright violence. Many of you might be familiar with Bloody Sunday from U2 and otherwise, right? That Bloody Sunday happened when British soldiers opened fire on a civil rights march, and that's largely seen as the powder keg that started the modern violence of the Troubles, where we saw over 3,500 people die, over 50,000 wounded in a really tiny area of the world, lasting for decades. Eventually, in the Belfast peace agreement, the long peace process that led to the peace agreement in '98, we saw a lot of addressing through aggressive legislative policies of trying to deal with some of these most rampant areas of inequality that we saw. Some of these provisions were actually written into the Belfast Agreement itself, dealing with some of these major issues. And this has been a big win for Northern Ireland. If you actually look at some of the stats now on some of these things like employment, housing, education, they're almost at parity, or in some ways Catholics have actually risen a percent or two above Protestants. So this has been a huge victory within Northern Ireland. But, and this is a very large but, what we do see in Northern Ireland is there's still these pockets of communities that have essentially been left behind from a lot of the growth that's happened. And this is in both Catholic and Protestant communities within Northern Ireland. Most of these are within the cities of places like Belfast and Derry. Most of the most deprived wards in Northern Ireland are urban centres. And most of these most deprived wards take place at, they're called interface zones, where Catholic and Protestant neighbourhoods butt up against one another. And these are also the areas that historically suffered the worst by far the results of violence. So where the most people died, were killed, or were impacted by the violence. This map is super tiny up here, but you can kind of see here, this is a map of the city centre of Belfast. All you really need to know, where it's bright red is where the most people died. And if you could see this a little bit closer and see some of the numbers here, it matches up literally in a one-to-one correlation with the most deprived neighbourhoods in the city of Belfast. And so what you get in the city of Belfast is the city centre, largely very developed, but a lot of the outlying areas where the violence happened in West, North, and East Belfast are where these most deprived communities are, about 25% more likely to be deprived. And in these areas, severely deprived. They've undergone multi-generations of deprivation in this. Now we're 2 to 3 generations from the Troubles on forward. And so what you get in Belfast is this tale of two cities, or a tale of two Belfasts, right? So in the city centre, you have this modern, really, really vibrant city, lots of great vegan restaurants, by the way, in there. You also have the development of things like Victoria Square, the Titanic Quarter. Of course, let's not forget Game of Thrones, right? Bringing lots of income and interest in cruise ships into the city of Belfast, which they never experienced before. So that's in the city centre and in South Belfast. But then you go out to any of those outlying areas ringing it, and this is much more what things look like in a lot of these. So you have cheek by jowl, severe deprivation next to some really modern development. And so this was my research question, is how has this deprivation and marginalization in these communities, how has that impacted this broader process of reconciliation between Catholic nationalist and Protestant unionist communities? As part of this, I was in Northern Ireland this past summer for about three and a half months. While I was doing a visiting research fellowship at Queen's University with the Senator George Mitchell Institute for Peace, Security, and Justice there, carrying out over 50 expert interviews with government officials, former combatants, civil society representatives, also really interestingly a lot of youth workers I chatted with at the time, and kind of building on some prior research that I did. And I only have a little bit of time today, so I'll just give you a snapshot of some of the key findings and things that I found really interesting. Not surprisingly, maybe, from what I've been saying, the people that do feel left behind, you've got these entire pockets and communities that don't really feel part of the peace process. They feel their lives have not improved after the Belfast Agreement. They haven't benefited from any of the so-called promised peace dividend that they hoped, right? After the end of conflict, our lives will get better, more investment will come in, and everybody will win. This hasn't happened, and particularly for those that fought and died during the conflict, they feel that their sacrifice was largely unrewarded as a result of this. So again, not surprisingly, severe anger, resentment, and dissatisfaction within these communities. And that's trickled over to dissatisfaction with the new Northern Ireland, dissatisfaction with the state, dissatisfaction with the political leadership, and with the peace process more generally. And so a lot of people have disengaged from Northern Ireland. And you see this particularly among the Protestant community, and I would argue, and many would argue, because they were the community that seemed to have the most to lose. They were previously very much on top, had access to some of the best housings and jobs, and life does not look the same for them as it used to, where Catholics, for the most part, have seen their lot actually improve, even though that's been muted in these most marginalized communities. And you've seen this play out in this huge move towards political polarization in Northern Ireland. The parties of the moderate center that brought about the peace process, people have fled those parties out to more extreme political wings, and a lot of people, myself included, would argue this is part of the reason we've seen this current deadlock and actual collapse of the Northern Ireland government. For the last year, it hasn't been up and going. If you travel to these neighborhoods, you also see that these are the most physically and socially segregated neighborhoods in Northern Ireland. While the city centres, South Belfast, some of the more affluent communities are largely mixed between Catholics and Protestants, these almost remain entirely single identity communities now. Almost all Catholics are all Protestants. Very few opportunities for positive contact and dialogue between children, in particular, growing up there. Some of them report they don't have a positive interaction with a member of the other community until they're over 18 years old, if you can imagine. And you see the physical barriers, things like this, these peace walls in Belfast, 30-foot high barriers between Protestant and Catholic neighborhoods, are a feature of the landscape, and there's actually more of those now than there used to be during the time of the peace process. It's also these neighborhoods where you see all the sectarian imagery in symbols, murals, bonfires, flags, parades of one group over another. You can see one of these giant pallet bonfires over on the other side, IRA scum written on the side of it. And it's also the pockets where we see the greatest levels of psychological segregation, so rampant prejudice, stereotypes, and sectarianism and fear in these communities. Though most troubling, and just to wrap up, what we see this actually manifest in is violence. These are also the neighborhoods, again, maybe not surprisingly, where even though we no longer see the large-scale political violence of the Troubles, we still see ongoing low-intensity sectarian violence. So if you're a Catholic that enters into this neighborhood, you could potentially be taking your own safety in your own hands. Recreational rioting, as it's called in Northern Ireland, there's a good bit of humor there. A lot of youths growing up in these incredibly deprived communities that don't feel they have a lot of other life prospects turn to rioting with members of the other community across these fences as an actual form of reconciliation, the opposite, recreation. These are also the flashpoints that we see for organized rioting when it happens. So if there's a major cultural event, a major issue that pops up, for instance, in 2012, 2013, the Belfast City Council decided to no longer fly the Union flag over Belfast City Hall, except on high holidays, like in the rest of the UK. This was seen as a major blow to the Protestant community and their place in that society, led to massive riots, a lot of them recruited and centered out of these neighborhoods here. And also in the 12th of July every year, there's a celebration that goes on over the victory of the Protestant King William over the Catholic King James. They still celebrate this. This happened a few hundred years ago with giant bonfires, parades, and obviously these are massive flashpoints as well. But last but not least, the most troubling thing is the rise of dissident paramilitary activity that's happened in here even after the peace process. So we've seen these are the major sources of recruitment and support for dissident paramilitary. So armed groups opposed to the peace process, so maybe the greatest single threat to the peace process as we know. These have taken the form of criminal activity. These have largely become criminal gangs involved in the drug trade, petty theft and arms trade as well, but they've also engaged in shooting and bombing attacks against the state and the police and members of the other community on both sides. These are also areas where we see ongoing really horrific violence that these communities of paramilitaries claim that they still carry out an internal policing role within their own communities, and so carry out things like punishment and attacks and beatings of youth. If you've ever heard the term kneecapping, this is kind of where it comes from largely. So if a youth is seen as being involved in petty theft or drugs, instead of being put forward to the police, the paramilitaries will shoot them in their knees or wrists or otherwise to incapacitate and debilitate them. Perhaps the most worrying thing that came out from this, though, is what's happening to youth growing up in these areas. Here you see the vulnerable youth being very much actively recruited by these paramilitary organizations to take part in the criminal activity or the sectarian violence. There's the common allure that we see in gangs all around the world of we don't have a lot of other life options. If I join up in the drug trade, I can get a car, money in my pocket, all of these things very quickly, and also buying into some of that sectarian ideology. And one of the quotes that really stuck with me, many hours of conversations, but some of the youth workers talk about the so-called battle for the souls that they're putting up for the youth growing up in these communities in Northern Ireland, where they're often underfunded and understaffed, but trying to provide a safe place for kids to go after school so they don't get recruited off the street by paramilitary gangs. So just to finish up here, what do we take away from what's going on in Northern Ireland? Not a lot of good stuff in these deprived neighborhoods. I think it really highlights the inherent fragility of the peace process in Northern Ireland. It shows how much many of these communities exist in this negative peace as opposed to a positive peace still caught by this. The most worrying trends is what's going on with youth in Northern Ireland today, in particular youth growing up here. There's a lot of fears about what's going to happen with the transgenerational transmission of conflict here. Many of these youths growing up after the peace agreement, but they're taking on the old sectarianism and violence of their parents, even though they weren't part of it. And these are all factors that we're talking about that are only going to be kind of really exacerbated by continuing austerity within the UK, all the challenges of Brexit, right, that are going to be coming up, and also the fact that the one organization, the government, that should probably be dealing with this has been collapsed for the last year because of political polarization. But all that to say, I think this really highlights the importance of dealing with some of these issues around marginalization along with the other issues of peace and justice in Northern Ireland. Thanks. Oh. And thank you, of course, to the Center for Global Studies, the Malcolm Wald Fund for Conversations on Democracy, and the Center for Social Justice Research on campus here. Thanks.
Well, thank you to all the speakers. I'd like to invite everybody to this table over here, because I think it would be good to give them some really difficult questions, right? So, especially the master's students who are going to defend their thesis, this is about as good a warm-up as you could possibly ask for. And of course, Nevin would accept very difficult questions. So do we have a volunteer for the first question? Hope this mic is on.
Yeah, for the fisheries lady, or girl, excuse me, woman.
So just stand and
Okay.
just let us know your name and who you're aiming this question towards.
To the lady that talked about the fisheries. What is the relationship between time and DNA? What are you looking for? Are there can't be cultural changes, so thank you.
Red button on the bottom.
Now, is that working? Okay. When I'm looking at the DNA, what I'm looking at is the relationship between the different fish. And so as time moves on and these species become different from one another, they accumulate those differences in their DNA. And so we can figure out, well, first of all, how far back these different species go in time before they were in the same population. And then you also can figure out the actual population size through time through looking at how different fish in the same population are. Because when population sizes are really small, you can get a lot of changes really quickly. Because when you have a really small population size, you don't have that many individuals who are actually reproducing to produce the next generation. And so you can really get a loss of different traits or a gain of different traits really quickly. Whereas if the population size is really big, then those effects are diluted more. And so you see more change when there's really small population sizes. And so we can see what the differences are in the DNA and then trace that back to when that happened based off of how many changes there have been.
Thank you. My name is Don Alston. I first want to thank everybody for taking the time, and I mean, the content was great, the delivery was great, the poise, the interesting research. Thank you all for what you're doing. But Dr. Aiken, I am not that familiar, I'm not that well educated, I think, on the Troubles. I know what I've seen in the movies and what I've occasionally read, but is the trouble that you see today uniquely confined in a way that is not representative of the high point of the Troubles to Belfast? I have a memory of violence being far beyond just Northern Ireland, in London and in other places within the UK. So is this somewhat contained, or really it looks just like it did, maybe a little bit of a smaller scale, but it looks very much like it did, you know, back during the Troubles?
So following a slightly depressing and pessimistic presentation, I'll start with a bit of optimism here. It definitely looks so much different than it did during the height of the Troubles. In terms of the lives lost, in terms of those wounded, in terms of the scale and where it goes on, it is actually very isolated and contained. So we don't see anywhere near the levels of sustained violence, the shooting and bombing attacks that we saw during the Troubles, during the height of the Troubles, anywhere in Northern Ireland, in the cities or otherwise. And we definitely don't see that really flowing overseas to the UK like we used to. You know, if you go, I was talking about the tale of two Belfasts. Within 20, 30 years ago, most of the city center would have been a series of security checkpoints that you would have to go through and be screened for bombs and guns. You wouldn't be able to park downtown. Downtown used to be a wasteland in Belfast because nobody wanted to go there for fear of what might happen to them. That is a thing of the past. You don't see any of the vestiges. If you visited Belfast these days, and I encourage you all to, even after that presentation, it's a wonderful place. And the city center, if you visited, you would have no idea unless you looked for it that there was a history of conflict there today. But, you know, and that's the point, is you go just outside of that into these rings and you would enter an area where it looks like the conflict never ended in terms of the damage. And though there's still violence there, it's on a much lower intensity, but there is still rioting. There are still shooting attacks. There are still vicious paramilitary attacks on youths within those communities. So much better than it used to be, but still some really worrying trends bubbling under the surface. Mm-hmm.
Hi, my question is also tied to Northern Ireland. Would you say that the rest of the United Kingdom is doing any sort of relief efforts, or would you say that Northern Ireland is sort of on its own for these types of problems?
That's a really good question. And yes, indeed they are, actually. Northern Ireland is an area within the UK that receives the greatest amount of kind of government payout and government subsidy out of anywhere else in the United Kingdom. So they receive an awful lot of money from the United Kingdom government to kind of prop up and invest in these kinds of social projects. Outside of the UK, Northern Ireland has benefited more from any conflict zone I've ever worked in from international funding. There's huge amounts of US funding from diaspora communities of Irish within the US and the strong ties between those countries. That's flowed in, you know, including philanthropic groups that have sunk millions or billions of dollars into Northern Ireland. And Last but not least, what's really worth mentioning, and this is coming up in the context of Brexit, right? Would Northern Ireland and the UK leave the EU? They've also benefited from billions of EU peace funding, as it's called, since the time of the peace agreement, and a lot of that funding has gone into programs specifically designed to build reconciliation and better community relations between Protestant and Catholic communities, and also directly into some of the development of some of these areas. You know, the one thing I might say is a lot of that has focused on raising levels of equality between the communities historically, but less so on this issue of marginalization in these pocket communities around there. And I think only now are people starting to turn towards realizing how important that is. But they've benefited immensely from the outside, for sure. Yeah.
Hi, Patrick Ivers for Danielle Peck. With the waste management, Germans are known for their organizational ability, and in the landfills, is there a recycling of materials that can be recycled first? Are organic materials being removed? So what is left in the landfills? Is this material that really can't be recycled in any other way?
Yeah, and just to clarify, do you mean the waste that's in the landfill itself from the past? Or just waste in general? Well, I guess I can just answer that question. So there have been gas chambers implemented within all of those former German Democratic Republic landfills and just former historic landfills. And what the gas chambers do is process the gases from the waste, and they often turn that into electricity. So a lot of the sites that I visited, they were fully powered by their own waste. And eventually, over time, that gas gets diminishes. And now there's been a lot of really progressive policies implemented. So, for instance, municipal household organic waste is no longer allowed to be landfilled. So one of my photographs that I wasn't able to point out due to time was of a big composting unit. So there's initiatives for composting. Also, what is implemented in the landfill is a dirt-like substance because the trash is now processed so much that anything that can be recycled is, and it's sent to different places. And then the final product of that waste is then processed with a cold treatment, and then it's put in the landfill as like a dirt. So it's very different process today than it was previously. And I know that they have taken certain initiatives to try to dig into some of those old landfills and properly process the waste and send it to different centers. But it's very expensive to do that, so that's not common practice there. But thank you.
I'd like to encourage perhaps a question on early childhood education or even internationalisation of education.
So this is for the international students arriving in China. Are they required to demonstrate some proficiency in Chinese languages before they come there? Or do they get into some immersion program where they learn the language first and then they go on to the whatever subjects they are going to take?
So students that wish to study abroad in China have two options: to enroll in Chinese language programs or parallel English language programs. If they enroll in the English language programs, they don't have to show any sort of language proficiency. However, if they choose to enroll in the Chinese language program, they either have to demonstrate proficiency or enroll in a one-year intensive language program, which oftentimes actually is still not enough to reach the level needed at the university level to understand lectures and materials required in the course. Thank you.
My question is regarding early childhood development. And I'm wondering, it seems that your research is quite expansive thus far already, but if you're able to go back to New Zealand, what are the next steps? What else do you want to learn about this process?
I think having all this background knowledge, I would be going back to the different early childhood education centers would be helpful, because when I first went in, I didn't have any idea of what the exposure was like. But I think knowing that now, I could look more deeply at what's going on there, and also just what is going on in New Zealand households in general.
Do we have any more questions for our panel? Okay, so I think we'll wrap up our panel and thank them one more time.
So we are starting our poster session and reception. So we've uncovered the food, so I offer you to get some food. I'd ask the people, I'll let you know who's doing the poster sessions, and they can go and be near their posters. I really encourage you to mingle. It's one of the reasons why we have food with this. But this is an opportunity to show off, and really show some of the other research that faculty and students have been doing. We have Laura Bayless, who's with UW Extension, and her work on a mixed methods approach to understanding older Ghanaian perceptions of physical activity. Sarah Ellengrod, who's a BA International Studies.